2 centuries ago, the Agamemnon sank here in Maldonado Bay at the mouth of the River Plate. Once a watering port for ships, this is one of the world's most treacherous bays. The bottom is shallow and ever shifting, the current strong. So many ships have gone down here that it's called the Sailor's Hell. With his partner Sergio Pronso, professional diver Hector Bardo recently found what he thought might be Nelson's Agamemnon. To deter looters, Hector kept the news to himself. He marked the spot using the global positioning system. Then he contacted Menson Bound.
So I'd like to see him go right through there. Okay. No.
Tuesday, the 25th of February, the search for the Agamemnon begins.
Thank you, Sergio.
This torpedo-like instrument will help relocate Hector Bardo's wreck. Towed behind the boat, it sends out sonic beams to the seabed. The beams show up as lines on a computer along with any strange shapes.
Yeah, you can make his turn now.
Brian, you can start your turn now. Now we've got something. This is it. Oh, look at that. It's a wreck.
Where's some paper?
There it is.
There it is, right there on the paper.
Look how well the casting goes.
See how the shadow indicates the fatter end, and then it comes down to a narrower thinner shadow?
That could be the trunnion.
We cut almost over top.
Yeah. Brian, carry on for another 50 meters, and then turn 180 to starboard. It is a beautiful wreck.
Menson warns the divers of the hazards of the River Plate.
The Plate is not a diver-friendly river. First, it's like mud soup down there. Most of the time, you'll be working in pitch blackness. So black you can't see your buddy, you can't even see what you're writing on your own slate boards. Stay with your buddy the whole time.
The divers grope their way through the pea soup of Maldonado Bay. And this is a good day. Just 5 meters down lies the bottom and a wreck. It bears all the signs of an 18th century warship. This is the stock of a musket. This comb was used against head lice. Then they find 2 objects out of place, a telescope and a navigational instrument called an octant, a captain's most prized possession. It turns out this is a Spanish wreck. In 1812, the Salvador was carrying troops to Montevideo when a storm blew up. She sank just meters from shore. Of the many tragedies witnessed in these waters, the sinking of the Salvador was one of the worst. 500 men lost their lives, but not the captain, who escaped on the only lifeboat with the ship's priest. This encrusted mass of silver was the pay the men never lived to spend. They retrieved the main objects to be measured and recorded. Then, because they lacked permission to excavate this wreck, they return them, carefully buried to protect them from looters. The Spanish ship dates from the Napoleonic era. Somewhere beneath the bay lies a British vessel of the same period, the Agamemnon. She looked like this replica of an 18th century frigate and was a supreme feat of engineering. This was the superweapon of its time. A man of war carried hundreds of sailors, food and water to last for months, and enough ammunition for years. Its fuel was free and inexhaustible. It mounted dozens of the mightiest weapons of its day and could take them anywhere on the seven seas. One broadside would sink a ship or set a city on fire. With a fleet of such ships, the British Crown established a worldwide empire. Friday, the 28th of February, Menson Bound resumes the search for the Agamemnon.
Yeah, I want to pass it. I want to make a turn to starboard 180.
Brian, can we put about and head for the eastern tip of Goriti? The eastern tip of Goriti. Fix on that and head straight for it. Over.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, probably a timber.
Yeah.
After several hours, the towfish detects something.
There you get a feature in there.
That's a better width right now.
Sure what's that right
what's
there?
this going here?
Once again, they're in liquid mud. Then they strike gold. This is the skeleton of a very old ship. These copper bolts once held together its backbone, the keel. They have found Hector's wreck. But is it Nelson's ship? Their challenge is to find something that points to Britain. Something that points to Nelson. The sixth of 11 children of a Norfolk parson, Nelson's career choices were the church, the law, or the sea. He chose a place on his uncle's ship. At the age of 12, Nelson became a midshipman. At 19, he was made a lieutenant. At the tender age of 20, a captain. He survived polar bears in the Arctic and yellow fever in the tropics. But one thing he never overcame: seasickness. During the American Revolution, Nelson won small victories for England. But when peace returned, his career foundered. Tedious smuggling duty, then unemployment. For Nelson, these years were the worst of times, followed by the best. As revolution swept France, the kings of Europe mustered their armies to save the French throne. On the 26th of January 1793, Nelson received command of a 64-gun warship, the Agamemnon. 1 week later, France declared war on England. France was desperate for men to lead its armies. Its officer corps had been ravaged by exile and the guillotine, so the new government quickly promoted young men with talent. One was an obscure 24-year-old lieutenant, soon to become a household name. He would lead the largest army the world had yet seen and prove one of its greatest generals. All Europe would tremble at his name: Napoleon Bonaparte. The war with France would give Nelson his first great victory. Ironically, it would come on land. In 1794, Nelson embarked on a British expedition to seize the French-held island of Corsica. Guarded by steep cliffs and stout fortresses, Corsica proved more than a match for the British general leading the invasion. But Nelson was undaunted. He vowed to capture the island himself with his own sailors, his own guns, and his own ingenuity.
On the 4th of April, 1794, guns winched from the 'tween deck of the Agamemnon were ferried ashore a little north of Bastia. With huge strops around the boulders, they used the Agamemnon's biggest block and tackle to haul the cannons over the rocks and up the cliff. With cutlasses, they hacked trackways and then dragged the guns to within 700 yards of the fortress walls.
When the French commander was asked to surrender, he replied, "I have hot shot for your ships and bayonets for your men."
The firefight that followed was murderous, with the enemy returning shell for shell and shot for shot.
After a long siege, the French had no choice but to surrender. For Nelson, the capture of Corsica was a resounding victory, marred only by a personal loss.
It was also here that Nelson was wounded for the first time, when a shell fragment ricocheted off the rocks and sliced its way across his upper face.
He wrote his wife that it nearly took off his head. It cost him the sight of his right eye. Nelson had proven himself on land. His next test would come at sea.
The 14th of March, 1795. A British squadron off the Italian coast near Genoa sighted a French fleet and raced to intercept it. First to arrive was the swift Agamemnon under Captain Horatio Nelson. His target was the monstrous 84-gun Saira. Despite being crippled and towed after a collision, she was still dangerous. Nelson attacked where her opponent's guns were fewest, the stern.
With consummate skill and panache, Nelson tacked the Agamemnon up under the rear of the heavily armed Frenchman. At point-blank range, he again and again fired double-loaded broadsides into her vulnerable stern.
For 2.5 hours, Nelson pounded the Saira. When the smoke cleared, 100 Frenchmen were dead or dying, and their ship was a wreck. Nelson expected the rest of the British fleet to join the fight. Instead, a cautious admiral ordered him back. Nelson was furious. Had I commanded our fleet, he wrote, the whole French fleet would have graced my triumph. Nelson had yet to prove what he could do in command.
Saturday, the 1st of March. Manson Bound's team returns to the wreck. They still don't know if it's Nelson's Agamemnon. They find plenty of artifacts typical of a man of war, but no hint as to its name. Then Sergio Pronso discovers a clue, a mark used for centuries to identify property of the British government, the broad arrow. Better still, the object dates from Nelson's time.
This is a 7.
Oh,
See the 2 lines?
Oh yeah.
No.
No, 7, you're right. 1797. It's the year of St. Vincent. The battle which made Nelson famous.
1797. Britain was fighting not only France, but also Spain. On the 14th of February off Cape St. Vincent, the British and Spanish fleets met. Although his own ship was outgunned 9-1, Nelson picked out a Spanish ship for boarding.
It was through a stern cabin window like this that Nelson came with a cutlass in one hand and a pistol in the other. The Spanish were firing at him from no more than 8 feet away as they barricaded the door. Nelson fought his way through and then up onto deck.
The British had fewer men, but better captains. Spanish steel proved no match for British metal.
Nelson accepted the Spanish captain's sword as a token of his ship's surrender. He then regrouped his men, and using this ship as a bridge, he stormed across onto the next.
Nelson captured both Spanish ships. The battle made him a national hero, a rear admiral, and a Knight of the Order of the Bath. This star, symbol of his knighthood, was to guide searchers of the Agamemnon. In 1993, when the wreck was first found, Manson Bound was invited to explore it with diver Hector Bardo. After 4 hours of large finds, Hector spotted a small, dark object in the sand. As he reached for it, it vanished in the silt. With powerful flashlights, Hector and Manson scoured the area. On the verge of giving up, Hector looked down, and there it was. It turned out to be a seal, but not just any seal. The letters spelled out Nelson, and it bears the Star of the Bath, the symbol of his knighthood. It's not actually Nelson's seal. It's a commemorative piece, but it could have belonged to an officer who served with Nelson on the Agamemnon. It's one more piece of evidence that they're on the right track. This seal was issued after one of Nelson's victories. Another seal was to help him win his next. April 1801. Nelson had a new ship and a new mission. Fearing Denmark was about to join the enemy, Britain sent a fleet to Copenhagen to deter the Danes. Nelson decided to attack where the Danes least expected, up a shallow channel behind a mudbank, where their guns were weakest. The Agamemnon led the attack.
The Agamemnon and the Edgar had pole position. They had the honor of leading in the British fleet. I mean, if you imagine this to be the British line. Okay, like this. Okay, here are the British ships. Antonio, do you mind? Okay, and here's the famous mudbank at Copenhagen. And over here, the Danish ships like that. And there's Copenhagen, the knife behind. Okay, so what happened was this. The British came in line ahead formation down the wide channel here. This was the Agamemnon, and what Nelson tried to do was come in behind the mudbank and attack from this end rather than that end, which is what the Danes were expecting. But right from the beginning, things went bad. Two of the ships, the Agamemnon being one of them, got stranded on the mudbank right here, had to sit out the action. So right from the start, the British were down two capital ships. We had Hyde Parker over here, some 5 or 6 miles away from the main action. He couldn't see what was going on. Now, he was Nelson's superior.
After 2 hours of heavy fighting, Admiral Parker believed Nelson was losing the battle. He hoisted the signal to withdraw.
And this, of course, was drawn to Nelson's attention, and he reached for his telescope, put it to his blind eye, looked through it and says, "Signal? What signal? I see no signal."
After another hour of hard fighting, Nelson was no closer to victory. So he bluffed. He sent the Danes an ultimatum. Either agree to a ceasefire, or else he'd destroy their capital. To convince the Danes he controlled the battle, Nelson deliberately took the time to seal his ultimatum. The Danes caved in. Once more, Nelson had left his mark on the world. Monday, the 3rd of March. Another dive, but this one is different. It yields the final clue to identify the wreck. In the late 18th century, the Royal Navy began lining the hulls of its warships with copper to protect them from sea worms. Now, all the pieces come together. The broad arrow, mark of the Royal Navy. The commemorative seal, a link to Nelson. And copper sheathing, a sign of the wreck's age. This is the Agamemnon. Now comes the hard part, mapping the wreck. To record the location of every object, the team will lay down a datum line, a reference line running the length of the wreck. So far, the team has set up 9 survey areas along the datum line. Site number 9 turns out to be rich in artifacts, but one is puzzling, a large iron wheel weighing more than 20 kilos. The team wonders what it was used for. It turns out to be a pulley.
They're 2.5-inch diameter rope.
Had to be. This is the principal biceps of the very ship.
Yeah. Think of the size of it with a great wooden shell around it. Probably side by side. The block must have been huge.
The wheels, or sheaths, were often made of iron. They directed the ropes that carried out the ship's heaviest work. The Agamemnon had 1,000 pulleys. These were its muscles. Without them, the crew could never have hoisted the heavy sails. Altogether, its sails weighed 10 tons and covered almost a hectare. Nelson famously used his pulleys to win a battle.
He used the very best blocks and tackles on the ship to drag the cannons over the rocks and up the cliffs at Bastia and later at Calvi. Bastia would not have been possible without this. It has to be it.
Yeah.
One of them, yeah. There's no doubt about it.
And
I mean,
these
these things, they lasted the life of the ship.
Site 9 also holds the oldest objects, the keel bolts. These copper bolts were used to attach the ship's backbone, or keel.
Quite heavy.
There've been hundreds of them, all along the keel, chunk, 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 like that. These were used to fasten the Agamemnon's lower assembly. This takes us right back to when she was first built at Buckler's Hard. These date to when the keel was first laid.
With just one keel bolt, Menson Bound can go back in time and rebuild Nelson's Agamemnon. Here on the River Beaulieu lies the new forest village of Buckler's Hard. "200 years ago, it was surrounded by oak woods that rang with the sounds of saws and hammers. For 5 decades, Buckler's Hard was one of the finest shipyards in England, thanks to the man who ran it, Henry Adams. With a head for maths and an eye for drafting, Adams could build from blueprints, rather than having to use crude models like most of his peers. With nothing but simple tools and manual labor, Adams could turn hundreds of thousands of pieces of wood into a 1,400-ton warship in a little more than a year. Until the coming of the skyscraper, this was the peak of human engineering.
Never has the hand of man fashioned anything more magnificent and terrible as the great wooden wind-driven fighting ship of the 18th and 19th centuries. And one of the finest of them all was the Agamemnon, Nelson's favorite ship of the line.
In this very hollow in 1779, she began to take shape.
A great 132-foot elmwood keel would have been laid right here, and several hundred chest-high copper bolts would have been used to bond together her lower assembly.
Building an 18th century man of war was like assembling a giant 3-dimensional jigsaw puzzle. After fastening the lower assembly to the keel, the builders attached the ship's ribs made of 100-year-old oak timbers. The stout crossbeams would also carry the weight of each 3-ton cannon on the 2 main gun decks. The hull was up to 60 centimeters thick to withstand the battering of enemy cannon. The hull was then triple sheathed in copper to protect against seaweed and sea worms. By reducing drag, this copper plating increased the Agamemnon's speed. Towering masts and sturdy spars carried her sails. The mast and sails were both controlled by 38 kilometers of rigging and 1,000 pulleys. Under full power, the Agamemnon was propelled through the water by 40 sails of all shapes and sizes. Below decks, she was armed with 64 heavy guns. In a single broadside, they fired a quarter-ton of cannonballs. Her biggest guns fired 10-kilo iron cannonballs well over 1.5 kilometers. Their deadliest range was 1 kilometer, at which distance the Agamemnon's gun crews could send cannonballs through solid oak. They could load and fire nearly twice as fast as their enemies. One broadside every 90 seconds. This was the Agamemnon, the ship Nelson commanded as he rose to fame. Thursday, the 13th of March. The team devotes another day to scanning the wreck of the Agamemnon. One key object is still missing: a cannon. Before the Agamemnon sank, all but 19 cannons were saved. Of those, none was ever retrieved. This is Menson's 4th day of scanning the seabed.
That's one piece and this is the other.
5 hours have gone by. Suddenly, a strange shape appears.
Okay, we've got stuff coming up now on screen. Look at that, Gary.
You can see the length, spatter at one end,
Got a
down.
beautiful cannon here, guys. You should see it.
That looks really good.
Nice. Okay, let's go another
You got
60,
everything
70
right there,
meters,
anchor.
turn around, reciprocal
All three,
course,
just
straight
one.
back over it.
Immediately, Menson decides to see for himself. He discovers it's lying on top of the sand, just waiting to be lifted. Menson needs 2 things: permission and a big crane. The paperwork alone could take weeks. Menson has only 10 days left. To bring up the huge gun, he needs to pull some strings. He goes straight to the top, to Montevideo, capital of Uruguay, to see the president. Julio Sanguinetti, Uruguay's president, keeps his eye on both the present and the past. Fortunately, the president has an interest in and recognizes the value of old shipwrecks. Sanguinetti wants to preserve Uruguay's maritime treasures before they're forever lost to looters or the sea. When Menson reveals he's found one of the Agamemnon's guns, Sanguinetti offers the use of a crane, but the Navy can spare it for only a day. It's a race against the clock. Saturday, the 15th of March. In preparation for the lift, Menson and Hector survey the gun. Over the centuries, the cannon may have been damaged by corrosion. Menson fears that under the strain of the lift, the gun will disintegrate in a cloud of rust. They decide to make a spreader bar. During the lift, the bar will distribute stress evenly along the gun barrel.
All these chains attached at the end.
Thursday, the 20th of March. The divers excavate a tunnel under the cannon to run lines for the spreader bar. In just 18 hours, the expedition will get its only chance to raise a gun that helped change the course of world history. After a decade of war, Napoleon had defeated every army thrown against him. He now prepared to conquer his greatest foe. To invade England, he assembled an army 500,000 strong and an armada of 50 French and Spanish ships. All that stood between Napoleon and victory was the English Channel and the British Royal Navy. In this crisis, England turned to one man, Admiral Horatio Nelson. Nelson had already given an eye and an arm for his country. At Trafalgar, he was about to give even more. In Nelson's time, navies fought in two parallel lines. They battered each other until one side chose to give up and run. Nelson didn't want to batter enemy ships into retreat. He wanted to annihilate them. In the days before the battle, he outlined his plan to his captains. They would sail right into the enemy line and break it. Then they would surround the rear and destroy it. By the time the enemy's vanguard turned around to engage the British, the battle would be over. This revolutionary tactic was to go down in history as the Nelson Touch. Late on the morning of the 21st of October, 1805, Nelson led his ships towards the Franco-Spanish fleet. At 12:30 p.m., the British broke the enemy line.
In the thick of the fight was Nelson's old flagship, the Agamemnon. Now she was commanded by Captain Edward Berry. Berry prepared to duel with the largest fighting ship in the world, the Santissima Trinidad. Mounting some 140 cannon, she outgunned the Agamemnon 2-1. But the Agamemnon was not alone. Other British warships were closing in. Santissima Trinidad was about to bear the full brunt of the Nelson Touch. Captain Berry laid the Agamemnon alongside the Spanish behemoth. They were almost muzzle to muzzle. Within an hour, the brown decks of the great Spanish ship were red with blood. 10 minutes later, she struck her colors and surrendered. By the end of the day's fighting, Nelson had captured more than half of the Franco-Spanish fleet without losing a single ship of his own. Nelson had won the greatest naval victory in history, but he didn't live to savor it. At 1:15, minutes after the battle began, a sniper high in the rigging of a French vessel took aim at the 4 stars on Nelson's uniform. The bullet that struck him was a lead musket ball, like one found by a diver at the Agamemnon's site.
So I found... This one looks like a fishing line.
No, it's shot.
This is in...
It's shot. I mean, this thing. Can you imagine being whacked by something like that? My God, this is more deadly than a modern projectile. This thing would have just back an inch deep wherever it went. The angle was very steep, came down like this, just slammed right into his epaulette, driving it down into the body, into the rib cage, went right through the left lung, severed the pulmonary artery, turned around, right down here, smashed through the lower spine right here, and then lodged itself in the muscles right down there.
Ow.
Yeah, it's painful.
Yeah.
You might say he drowned in his own blood.
Throughout the afternoon, officers brought Nelson reports of the battle. He lived long enough to learn he had won a great victory. "Thank God," he whispered, "I have done my duty." At 4:30, he died. Even in victory, Britain was overwhelmed with grief at the loss of their greatest hero. Friday, the 21st of March. The naval vessel Sirius arrives. But below deck, there's trouble. Her generator has broken down. Without power for the crane, the lift is impossible. Tomorrow, Manson gets his only shot at the gun. The ship's engineer promises to do his best. Friday, the 21st of March. Divers off the Uruguayan coast prepare to retrieve an 18th century cannon. But on the salvage vessel Sirius, the mission is jeopardized by a dead generator. There is no time to wait for a spare part. Instead, the ship's engineer works through the night in the machine shop to make the part himself. At 3:30 the next afternoon, the ship's captain brings long-awaited news to the leader of the expedition, Manson Bound. Saturday, the 22nd of March. The hastily repaired salvage vessel Sirius leaves the port of Punta del Este in the company of 3 tugboats and the Coast Guard, heading for the wreck of the Agamemnon. Four years after Trafalgar, the British ship entered these same waters. She never left them. In June 1809, 8 warships, including the Agamemnon, were stalking a French squadron when their hunt led them into the treacherous waters of Maldonado Bay. Early on the 16th of June, as the Agamemnon rounded Gority Island, her hull scraped the bottom and the sea flooded in. Helpless, her captain gave orders to abandon ship. 4:15 p.m. The salvage team anchors over the grave of the Agamemnon, 800 meters off Gority Island. Here, the Agamemnon's crew came ashore, choking on salt water and tears.
After leaving the Agamemnon, the men regrouped right here upon the sands of Gority Island, only a few yards from where the wreck foundered. Accounts tell of how war and weather-hardened old mariners blubbered like babes as they clambered down her sides for the last time. But this was not just any ship they were abandoning. This was the Agamemnon.
Two centuries have passed since the Agamemnon last fired her guns. Now one of them is about to be lifted. The team has only 3 hours in which to do the job. If the spreader bar works, the cannon won't collapse into a pile of rust. But there's another potential problem. Once the gun breaks the surface, it could spin out of control, damaging itself or the crew. At Trafalgar, the Agamemnon's guns helped win one of history's greatest naval victories. This gun also forged one of the world's great superpowers.
The history of the world was shaped during a single afternoon in October 1805, when 73 ships congregated off a remote coast of southern Spain for what was to be the last large-scale battle under sail. It involved the British, the French, and the Spanish. But by the end of the day, there was only one clear, undisputed victor. From the guns of Trafalgar to those of August 1914, Britain was the supreme naval power in the world. Trafalgar was over 10 years in the making. It involved over 3,800 guns, and by the end, 1,500 men were either dead or dying. As far as I'm aware, of all the guns that fought at Trafalgar, this is the only securely identifiable piece in the world today.
The rest of the great ship Agamemnon vanished long ago in mud and sea. An ignoble grave for a noble ship. All that remains is a skeleton, a ghost of Trafalgar. A grander tomb awaited the Agamemnon's celebrated former captain. Here in St. Paul's Cathedral lies the much-mourned body of one of England's greatest heroes.
Vice Admiral Viscount Horatio Nelson.
He was, without any doubt, Britain's greatest hero. And he died just as he would have wished, at the moment of his greatest triumph.